Hello everyone. Not long ago I started reading the manga Goblin Slayer, and this is the first volume. And I had some thoughts about Goblin Slayer as it pertains to tabletop role-playing games or even D&D-like games. D&D itself or its similar um, inspired systems. So I just wanted to go over, I'll do some videos over time, I guess, as I go over these volumes and give my thoughts on every single volume in itself, by itself. So because I'm not far into the series, I just want to say there might be some things that what I say now might be contradicted later by another volume. You know, like one point I'll come to later, spoilers, but one point I will come to later is that to play the Goblin Slayer, like you don't need special stats, a special Goblin Slayer class. You don't need it's not a prestige class. It's not no matter what edition of the game, but like it's just a good old fighter, as far as I can tell right now. Yes, the character specializes in killing goblins, but I'll get to that in a bit. But that's one thing that, for example, later on I might read a later volume, be like, oh, that's something that a normal fighter totally wouldn't do, and etc. So that was one thing I wanted to address. That I'll be going one volume at a time. I'm not far into the series. I'll be talking about spoilers. And also I want to say the very, very unpleasant aspect of this series, because this series has a very unpleasant aspect when it comes to mature subject matter. That one I will not be touching upon, I don't think, ever. If at some point it becomes necessary for me to mention that very dark subject matter related to the series, I will let you all know at the very beginning of the episode. But for now, I don't see it as something needed. I'll just be mentioning that goblins are very evil in this, and that's it. For anyone else who is curious about what might be the way in which goblins are very, very evil in the Goblin Slayer world, you can Google it, but I'm warning you, it's very dark. Think of maybe one of the worst possible things you can think of, and that's probably what you're thinking of. So anyway, yeah. So first of all, okay, let's talk about it. First of all, when I read Goblin Slayer, you know what's kind of funny is that normally when I see something fantasy by that's a manga or an anime or whatever, like I don't really seek those out very often, but when I come across it, either in passing or actually watch the material or read the material, it often seems to me very new school in its approach. Like characters are jumping very high, they're doing like superhero like stuff, and then it makes me think of more modern iterations of D&D, like third edition upward. But with the case of Goblin Slayer, I actually think of the OSR, old school, style, like the editions from the very first version of D&D all the way to advanced D&D second edition. That's what it makes me think of. Like Goblin Slayer, I see much more as a game that would be played with BX D&D or a retro clone, or like Castles and Crusades. Basically, and yeah, you can do Goblin Slayer with third edition and upwards, but it's so gritty that it doesn't make me think of a version of D&D where players are almost like superheroes. As a quick side note, I want to mention that there is in Japan there is a Goblin Slayer, an actual tabletop role-playing game for Goblin Slayer, and apparently it's going to be translated. Now, personally, I I don't know. I don't know if I like Goblin Slayer for a lot of reasons, but like what the stuff that goblins do is kind of like it's fine to read it in a story, but I don't know if I would like to play in a game where that is a thing that can happen regularly, and where it's like expected of the bad guys at all times, nonstop. So again, for those who want to know, you can Google it. But like, how do you bring player? I mean, yeah, some people will enjoy it. That's fine. But I think first of all that it's kind of like a record of Lolo's War, where they ended up with their own system apparently, but it was D&D initially. So you can play with D&D. You don't need its own. It doesn't need its own role playing game. I mean, I guess it does for people who are very like to collect stuff and But yeah, I just find it would be kind of awkward at a game table, or maybe not. I don't know. I'm talking for myself. Okay, whatever. I'm rambling. So okay, and so under the light of me seeing Goblin Slayer as an old school version of the game, I will be going through some things where I think it's very old school. So first of all, the goblins are irredeemably evil, and in modern times, like it's become a thing where like, oh, monsters are no longer always evil and all that, and some people celebrate that because they confuse the use of monsters with like real life human beings of different backgrounds, and which I find weird. um, but to me, I kind of see like, does anyone remember when like vampires became lame because of Twilight, and everyone's like, like, I mean, there was like this new fan base that love vampires as sparkly romantic partners, but a lot of people like me who liked old school vampires, like actual vampires, everyone's kind of like, yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to when we can all agree vampires are monsters, right? And yeah, so to see goblins be so legitimately evil, I don't particularly enjoy what the like, obviously, but um, to me, for my personal enjoyment, I'm not criticizing the manga for it. My personal enjoyment, what the goblins do as evil beings, is something that detracts from my enjoyment of the material. I like the material despite the aspect. However, it is refreshing for me to see this like just outright, yeah, they're evil and they're gonna do evil stuff. So the certain thing they do, I find it's a bit much for me. I can enjoy the manga despite it. And it's not a critique. I'm talking about my own personal, what makes me uncomfortable and all that. So I'm not even like, I'm not saying it's a flaw of the manga. I'm just saying, but putting that detail aside, the fact that they're irredeemably evil is refreshing. It's cathartic. Um, so I want to mention that. In fact, the what the Goblin Slayer does at some point to the goblin babies, like, okay. Again, it's uncomfortable, but at least it's a different narrative than the one where like goblins are now these funny gadgeteers, and stuff like that. Which I don't even have a problem with, like more modern takes on goblins, but I just like that there's a choice to be had, right? Yeah. Then another thing that was interesting is like the initial group of adventurers, again, spoilers, that you see in Goblin Slayer, the ones who get, almost all of them get killed. It's interesting how as they get killed, you have flashbacks to their backgrounds and their character backgrounds. And again, that tells me like this. To me, that's a very old school sensibility that your backgrounds don't matter. Because in 5e now, there's this tendency to always like for players to create these long backgrounds to start with a player one character that you don't know is going to get to level 2 in an old school game. And 5e, you can expect it. I think in 5e, you can level up after one game or something. So it's kind of like that second level, and then it's a lot easier to survive. But it's kind of funny how you see those backgrounds. Well, it's not funny. It also makes it more horrifying what the goblins are doing to them, because you can see them as actual characters because you see their past, and that's it's harsh. But at the same time, it's funny when you take a step back and look at like, oh, those backgrounds don't matter. Like, like your characters might just not make it. I don't mean they don't matter. Sorry. I think it's important to make backgrounds for characters. It's also okay for people to start without really knowing where the characters came from and just discovering that through a game. Or it's perfectly fine to have a long background. But for me, like as a game master, like I'm okay with both ways that players want to do it, but it's not going to change their survivability. Sorry. If they made it all on background, they're starting their player one character, their level one character. It's not because they put all that time and effort that their characters are gonna survive more in my game. It's gonna come up more with their decisions and the luck of the dice. Okay. Now, another thing that's I find it to be very old school is that even in old school games, you had like checks to find secret doors or hidden passages and stuff like that, but what you said or observed or what the game master described was very pertinent also to those roles, or sometimes they were not even needed or something. And that was in that story. At some point, a Goblin Slayer shows this new adventurer, the cleric, the priestess, how her party of adventurers before, like, they had passed by a totem and they hadn't noticed a second branch of the cave they're in. And so the Goblin Slayer explains that the totems are there to distract, and people there, they're going to look at the totem, and so they're going to miss the second branch of the cave because of the shadows. It's easier to miss. Like you're gonna bring the torch towards the totem to look at it, and therefore the spot where the cavern like splits, or there's another passage, is not illuminated, and you miss it, and that's where the goblins come from behind them. And that was interesting because to me, it's almost like it's not even a matter of rolling dice anymore. It's how you describe your action. Like if the game master is saying like there's a totem ahead of you, but it's like very much in shadows, and so the players are going to look at it. So they're going to be like, oh, I bring the torch to see it better, and then they move on, for example. So in that description, they haven't said that they move the torch back around to look around. Whereas a more experienced player in that style, who knows that it's not about rolling the dice, it's how you describe things, then they might say, I then move my torch back around to the other side to see if there's anything else. And then, without having to roll any dice, the game master might be like, well, you see a second passage, which you wouldn't have seen if you hadn't described that you looked the other way. So then, yeah. Now, you can also do it with rolling dice. It can simply be like, there's a totem, and then like people get a roll perception check to see if they notice the other thing on the side. Yeah, so it could also be just a rolling the dice, but I kind of I personally fall somewhere in between, where sometimes like something that's obvious, if the players describe something correctly, I will just let them have it. And other times, like, yeah, a die roll is needed, but you still have to kind of do the right thing to get that die roll. Otherwise, you're just gonna miss it entirely. Unless something is like an elf's passive ability to detect doors as they pass by without having to look for them. Like maybe there's some cases where, okay, the game itself tells you there's going to be a die roll there, but very often what players tell me they're doing is very important to me. I might make exceptions for new players who are used to another style of playing, but normally I do it at first just to ease them in, and then I still roll for perception, things like that, like to see if someone notices a sounder. But for very specific things that are just more like logically what your character does. Yeah. So that's very old school of me. I put player skill over the stats in that sense. Although I think stats are very important, shouldn't be ignored. And then another thing that I found interesting was, again, players think, like new players think of like traps. Oh, I need to have the skill for that or whatever. I need to have stats that tell me I can design traps. But what the Goblin Slayer sets up as a trap with the priestess is like he grabs the rope with he ties the rope on both sides of a passage, and then he tells her like, okay, don't forget the rope is there, and then when you run past it, you jump over it, and you cast light on the attacking monster, and the monster's gonna trip on the rope. You don't need any skills for that. It's just placing a rope there, and then using a spell that one of the characters has in a very strategic way. Also, in that manga, they address the resource management of the game. So, like, the priestess will say how many spells she has left and such. But that's not unique to old school games. Like, every version of the game is resource management. It's just that in some versions you have a lot more resources than the other. than others. So again, like the Goblin Slayer often uses traps, but he uses traps that are very much just described, like coming up with an idea and applying it without having to really, you know. I guess you can make the player roll to make sure that they set it up right, so it's not flimsy. But even that, setting a rope, I would say maybe it's just like a check for like a common sense check, like intelligence or strength, to make sure they tie the knot strong enough or something along those lines. Like I don't see it as being like a traps skill. To me, a trap skill would then have to involve like very elaborate trap making mechanisms and such. Or in the sense that in the forest, everyone can dig a pit, put spikes at the bottom, and then put branches on top. You don't need a special ability for that. For example, in Castles and Crusades, Rangers, if I remember correctly, I'd have to check the book, but anyway, they can set up traps in the wilderness. So to dig a pit and put spikes and then like put branches on it, like a fighter can do that. Again, like if a ranger does it, then to me it's like more elaborate trap that has like maybe a noose that will pull a person up, like we've seen in a lot of movies and stuff like that. So again, very old school, where the characters just come up with ideas. They don't need to be like, oh, the Goblin Slayer is an expert trap maker. No, he just had a rope and two like stakes to put on the ground, if I remember correctly, and they just use it that way. Also, kind of what's funny in a way, I just thought of it now. It wasn't like I just thought of it, but another aspect that's very old school is like the Goblin Slayer uses like all crappy old equipment, and there's a reason in the story for that. But other adventurers have like fancy equipment, maybe even magical equipment. They kind of look down on the Goblin Slayer, and that makes me think of the Goblin Slayer as this old school player, like who just is not gonna use anything fancy, but his good old tricks and his ability in combat and his tricks and his strategies. He doesn't need like the fancy stuff, like so that also kind of makes me think of like old school, or like new school players. Oh, back then characters didn't have all these skill points, and they didn't have like feats, and they have stuff like that to customize them, or they didn't have as many magic items, but what happens in old school type games is more like the player skill is more important. Like in a lot of old school games, if a character is just trusting the fact they have a +3 longsword, and to them that's, oh, I'm gonna kick ass with this. I don't need to be strategic. They're not gonna survive as long as like a character with a crappy strength score and a rusty old short sword. So that's just an example. Anyway, that was a thought I had. Something else, again, kind of like traps, is at some point like they set a place on fire, and the priestess, the cleric, uses protection, which normally keeps the monsters away from you, but they do it at a gate inside, like inside some walls, castle walls, I think. Well, anyway, so like they set it on fire, so all the goblins will want to attack them and get out of there. But then the priestess, by casting protection in that spot, it blocks them, so they can't get out. So, and like the priestess even like questions like, should I be using my spells like this? This is what my god would have wanted. Um, so again, it's just like it's very strategic, but not in necessarily knowing how to combine abilities and stuff like that, but more strategic in using the environment and using what you have, but knowing how to apply it in different ways with the environment you have. And again, this is like, like when the Goblin Slayer comes up with that plan, to me that's a player coming up with a plan. It's not a player doing an intelligence roll, a strategy roll, and then the game master is like, oh, you think of this elaborate thing that the game master serves on a platter. It's not that, like very often like players who have like strategy rolls or something, from what I've seen, it's like they're gonna get a bonus in battle, and that's like for other people and them to swing their swords or something. It's not actual strategy. It's just like this very vague form of strategy where like the player will be asked to maybe say something like, oh, stab under the shoulder where the armors don't cover them. Like they come up with some quick reason why they have a bonus, and then the fight is the same as always. It like the bonus is just it increases their chances, but it doesn't change that they're still swinging swords at each other. Whereas real strategy, they killed most of the goblins in there without having to put themselves in danger even to. So that was another thing I thought of. Yeah, so that was Vol.1. And again, what's interesting is to me, like you could totally do a Goblin Slayer with a good old BX D&D fighter. You don't need any special stat for that. You just need a fighter who can swing a sword and wear armor, and that's it. And use all of the weapons because he changes weapons regularly. And that's all you need for the Goblin Slayer. It's a good old fighter, and to me, that's what's interesting about the series because for me at least, it has very old school sensibilities, and I don't know if others will disagree. I don't think so, but if you disagree, let me know in the comments, or if you agree. And it's just what a player of the Goblin Slayer does that's important, not the stats. And that's like the Goblin Slayer, I don't think has stats for trap making. I don't think he has any special abilities to damage goblins more. The player just learned over time, oh, when goblins put a totem there, that means it's a trick, to distract visually. And also can give an idea to game masters that, it's kind of interesting because sometimes, like, especially when everything is handled with die rolls, like the game master will be like, oh, you detected this trick. But then once the trick has been detected by players, it's never seen again in the campaign. And so the totem, for example, distracting from the second passage. So whatever you include in your campaign as a trick that some monsters might use or some bad guys might use or stuff like that, what I encourage you to do is to use it again later on. And yeah, players will recognize it right away, and therefore they're going to avoid that danger very easily. But what it does is it rewards their investment in the setting, in the world you're creating. If in your world, for example, like in the Goblin Slayer, like the goblins put a totem somewhere in their caves, in their lairs to distract players from something else, and the players know this. Now every time they see a totem, they act accordingly. It's very rewarding for them, and that is something that has a lot of value. So the player of the Goblin Slayer has invested in the setting, not in skills or feats or whatever. Goblin Slayer the player has like paid attention to what's going on in the setting, and that's the type of experience that has nothing to do with experience points. It doesn't matter whether the Goblin Slayer is like level 3 or level 10. That knowledge he just has, Okay, yeah, that's it. So these are just thoughts I had on that series. So that's the first volume of the manga, and I'll be doing at some point in time the second volume. I own and have read the first two only. So as I read them and as I feel inspired to make a video about it, I'll make more. And if there are any topics that any of you would like to cover me in the next episode, also let me know in the comments, please. I was pleasantly surprised to see my previous video had a lot of engagement and comments, at least by my standards, okay? And that was really fun. So I'd like to encourage you all to continue commenting, and I reply to all the messages up until it becomes, if ever there's too many, then okay, but as long as it's feasible for me to reply to all the comments, I will. And yeah, let me know if you like this video. Let me know if there's any topics that you like me to comment on. Let me know if there's any thoughts that you have about anything I said or something I missed about Vol.1. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.